It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And it is UFC 300 week, and we've got a few things we wanted to break down very quickly that stuck out to us amid all this hullabaloo leading into what is supposed to be the biggest card of the year. Since this is what we like to call a mini-sode, we're going to dive right in and get right to the meat and potatoes of UFC 300. Now, first off, there's been a lot of buzz around the redesign of the UFC glove. Now, while it will not be in use at UFC 300, the UFC PR machine decided to unveil it this week as part of their extracurricular 300 promotional material. And images like all of the gloves lined up together, the golden glove for the champions, and blah, blah, blah. We even got like a Da Vinci-esque diagram of the glove and how it was designed and what each component of it does. That's been released, but I could not help but notice a couple of things. First and foremost, the glove has a good bit of extra leather that sticks up, and it makes it look very much as though the glove itself could end up causing an accidental eye injury. But that point is beside what I want to talk about, which is that nothing is really going to mitigate eye pokes unless penalties are enforced. Now, John and I have a Twitter pal. Her name is Snarky Ginger, and she very astutely noted that penalties are likely the only way that fighters will stop leading with their hands open. The nature of the sport involves grappling and an open-fingered glove. It invites open hands that anticipate grappling exchanges as well as John's beloved face punching. Now, she also noted how enforcing meaningful penalties might not improve the sport. And that sort of hit me like a ton of bricks. So my question for John is, would you mind laying out the revenue split one more time for the folks that are new here, and the contract language that basically shows how heavy an impact this would be to the lower tier entry-level fighters if all of a sudden they started getting penalized for eye pokes?
Well, as not an expert at gloves. So first of all, let me go through and say that the revenue split, as we know, is whatever the UFC says the revenue split is. So there's no, it's not like other major sports where there's a contractual revenue split. But right now we imagine it's in the 15% range where the fighters get 15% of all the revenue. So it's, there's not a lot of money going to the fighters. It seems as if that the bottom guys' wages have not been rising that much since Endeavor took over. We are still at the same 10 and 10 minimum, right? So their wages have not gone up much. The majority of the pay has gone to the top guys who are still, I would argue, grossly underpaid. So I guess if you're asking how much they would be hurt, additional fines would hurt them a lot. Yes, because they are not making much. In fact, just to promote an interview, you did a great interview you just did with Jim Miller. He makes the observation with almost every fighter of up until you get to the very top guys who've got guaranteed pay, is that if you need to win to make money on your fight, that your show money, as we call it, the base money, that is going to cover all your expenses, but there's no profit in fighting for almost any fighter unless you get the win bonus. So that right there tells you if you're getting money deducted for eye pokes, it might get fighters to stop doing it. But there's a lot of, I'm going to bring up something in a second here. There's obviously a lot of accidental eye pokes. So if they're going to find people, which would get people to think about it and do it less, it's definitely going to hurt the bottom guys more.
Now, when you talk about the UFC fighters getting 15% and the UFC taking 85% of the revenue, would you mind telling us what UFC revenue looked like, say, last year or something off the top of your head that you remember?
Well, last year they hit about $1.2 billion in revenue. So, which is, that's pretty good revenue, I would say. I would argue that is some decent revenue right there for the UFC. In fact, actually, I think it was closer to 1.3 billion. They were 1.292 billion off the top of my head. So almost 1.3 billion, of which we estimate that the fighters' share of that is about 192 million.
Oh my goodness.
So about 15%. So, but we know it can't be much higher because the earnings, the profit margins of the UFC, I shouldn't say profit margins because they had so many transaction fees because of their merger with TKO, but their EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxation, depreciation, and amortization, that was extremely high. That was over $700 million last year. So 756 million to be exact. So with that kind of earnings coming in, obviously the fighter cost is not super high. So that we know. So that 15%, it's not like it's contractually guaranteed. It's not like the collective bargaining agreement with the NFL players where they get 48%. And they got kind of hosed in the last deal, I will say. But they get 48% of all revenue. A big chunk of that, I think 90% of that goes to wages, and the rest of the 10% goes to benefits. So the fighters get 15%. You got to remember this too. When we say 85 for the UFC and 15% for the fighters, people are saying, well, the UFC has all these expenses. So do the fighters, and they got to bear these expenses themselves, as we just talked about. They got to pay for their management, their training, their equipment, and so they bear a tremendous risk. And that their costs, while the UFC costs apparently are less than 50% because their EBITDA is 58% margins. They keep, their costs are 42%. For the fighter, for a lot of them, it's 100% of their costs unless they win. So that just a little additional details there.
I have one last question to ask you before I move on to our second topic here. And that is, would you mind telling everyone what a boxer, what their share of the revenue, say for, I don't know, Matchroom or Top Rank or PBC, what do their boxers make? What do their athletes make as far as revenue share?
Well, it depends what athlete you're talking about now. It's fair to say that the average UFC fighter does much better than the average boxer. They do much better than the average MMA fighter because partly they're at the very top of the sport. But even boxers at kind of their comparative level for an entry-level UFC fighter, same record, same position, UFC fighters generally do a little bit better. But when you start moving up the ladder in MMA and UFC and boxing, it's obvious the boxers start earning a lot better. And when you look at their revenue split, on average, we looked at Warriors boxing, Leon Margolis, Golden Boy, Top Rank. When you add them all together, it's over 65% of the revenue is going to the boxers. And Eddie Hearn says the same for his promotion. He points out the bigger event does, the higher the share goes to the fighters because they get the top stars start collecting more, the more profit it makes. So and we see that too in Top Rank's reporting that an event, a lower end event might pay 50%, 60% to the fighters, but a very successful pay-per-view might end up paying 80 or 90% of the revenue to the boxers. So the split, it fluctuates like all things, but on average, I shouldn't even say on average, it's pretty obvious that boxers in totality, boxers for the major promoters in totality get a much, much higher percentage than UFC fighters do.
All right. Now we're going to move on to the second topic here in our UFC 300 minisode. Dana White announced to a delighted crowd yesterday at their Q&A presser that Justin Gaethje had suggested to him, hey, let's make the bonuses for UFC 300,000. And so Dana said, okay, we're going to do that. And he announced that. And everybody went wild, including the media. Because instead of their standard 50,000, it'll be jacked all the way up to 300,000 for this one event. And everyone sort of is looking at Dana White like he's the messiah for this. And I am sitting here just aghast because 4 fighters getting 1.2 million split between them one single time seems kind of, what's the word I'm looking for here, John? What's that word? Exploitive? That's the word you taught me today. That's right. Exploitive. Could you explain why those 4 fighters getting $300,000 in bonuses each is still exploitive, considering how much the UFC will make on this event?
Wow, we're coming in hard on the UFC today for their big 300. We're being very harsh on them. I'm going to kind of defend them here for a second because I do believe the UFC has is a monopoly, de facto monopoly. They have over 90% of the market that by just makes you a monopoly, have monopoly power, right? I believe they have monopsony power because of that. I think that's a given. I think there's no argument about that. I think the UFC here, they pay their fighters way too little because they have monopsony power. But here's something interesting about this UFC 300. Now, we all agree that the fighters are underpaid, but compared to the UFC 100 numbers, the 100 and 200, on average, it paid a much higher share of the wages and a much higher total pay compensation than other events. Namely, because they have big stars on it. UFC 100 had Brock Lesnar. He got $3 million for that fight. I think Frank Mir, we know he got about $500,000. So he's recently complained about that he should have got more, he said. And GSP got almost $4 million for that original UFC 100. So the total pay for that event was over $10 million, I believe, in total compensation to fighters, which was a large amount for an event back then, right? And the UFC, though, the event itself generated almost $40 million for the UFC. So even though the wage share they're paying to fighters back in UFC 100 was over 25% higher than normally is, when you look at the fighter cost is $10 million and the other costs for that event were $5 million, and we know that because the UFC antitrust case had that buried in there somewhere. That means there was additional $25 million that they got to keep. The promotion got to keep for that event. So it shows you on one hand just how incredibly profitable and how how exploitive the UFC can be. UFC 200 the same. They made $55 million. All the fighters got $18 million for the event. So again, that were almost $19 million, I believe. So they made a tremendous amount of money. They paid the fighters more than they would for any other event, but they made a lot. It looks like they're going to do something similar because of their ESPN deal. I don't know if they're going to see the high end that they'd normally see for the type of sales they got, because ESPN pays them a flat fee for every event, and so they don't get they don't see the huge returns they would on big events because they get a lot more money for bad performing events. And so the UFC might not see a tremendous amount of money for this event like they would normally based on the numbers, but they also don't have the big stars on this event, right? They don't have Brock. They don't have GSP. They don't have Anderson Silva. They don't have these guys that are going to collect much higher purses than normal. So their pay actually for this event, I got a feeling is going to be kind of low. And so that $1.2 million they're going to give them bonuses might have been kind of what they earmarked for the budget for this event because they expected to pay more. And so it's kind of, I guess you could say it's good that the UFC's, instead of saying, hey, let's keep the expenses low, let's put a little more in. That part's good. The bad part is that the percentage is still going to be low. The other good news is for the fighters. I'm going to try to be positive here, not a negative Nancy here. The good news for the fighters, I guess, is if the bottom guys on the card win, and I guess the good news too is we're not having like entry level fighters really on this card. We're having kind of journeymen and higher ranked guys that I think are grossly underpaid. If they win it, the bottom guys and not the headliners, well, then we've actually distributed the money, I guess, more fair. I wouldn't say fairly, but there's less inequality in the card. And so it would be nice for the guys that, that I think are grossly overpaid and perhaps struggling more with their career and their future to see them get a big payday from this on this event. But it's also a good chance that the very top guys, who also I think are underpaid, could walk away with all 4 prizes, and which they might not notice as much if they're making a couple million for the event.
All right. So there we saw John give sort of a little bit of support to the UFC pay structure here just for this event.
I'm so evil. So I can't believe I'm betraying everybody like that. I'm
going to do the same thing here because my last topic is that this card boasts 12 current or former champions. And in fairness, it is one of the most stacked cards we've seen from them in years. The name value might be missing at the top. It is definitely lacking the pizzazz befitting a 00 card. But overall, it's a great card. I mean, even the Curtain Jerker is a good fight. But the difference in what makes a current champion and a former champion is really, really stark, especially in their pay scale. So my question to you, and this is the final one of our mini-sode here, could you explain what the financial perks of being a champion are, and conversely, how dramatic the drop-off, how dramatic the changes when you go from being a champion to a former champion?
Well, there's actually just a wide range. So, but we have some, I guess, some templates or some standards the UFC uses. Generally, not speaking about stars, but generally for most fighters, they get, they move on to higher tiers as they keep winning and moving up the roster. And so they might get up to, let's say, I think the final S tier, whatever, like 150,000 to show, 150,000 to win. Those are like the top fighters, right? Usually before they even fight for a title, they might not reach that level. But usually the contracts of the challenger types will have something that if you fight for the title, your pay will be bumped up to a flat, let's say, if you're a heavyweight or light heavyweight, 500,000. And if you win the title and hold it, you get pay-per-view points. Well, it depends on, how well your event does. If your event doesn't sell super well, the pay-per-view points don't mean anything because they only kick in at 200,000 and they're only $1 a buy originally, and then they move up to $2. So the pay-per-view points are really only worth a lot if you're on massive events like this. The fighters with pay-per-view points on this event, if it truly sells over 1 million buys, they'll do great. They'll do a couple extra million in buys. But if you're on an event that sells, what did Aljamain Sterling said in some Twitter thing that he only sold over 200,000 once, I think it was. At that case, then you're not making a lot on pay-per-view. So as a pay-per-view champion, the perks is you get a higher purse, although it technically is not an amazing purse, and you get pay-per-view points. Now, for some champions, though, if you can win several fights and negotiate as champion, you can get a side letter or a larger contract. And what that is, instead of the typical 500,000 for a heavyweight or light heavyweight to show up and fight, you can say, I want my 500,000 plus an additional $1 million. Sometimes you have to sacrifice some pay-per-view points for that. The pay-per-view bonus doesn't kick in till later, but sometimes you don't have to. But you have a more guaranteed contract where you walk into the event making over $1 million, let's say. That's some champions. And then there's the big stars that can, like GSP and Anderson Silva, that they have a side letter that they can ask for millions, McGregor as well, and pay-per-view points. So that's the kind of the tiers of the champion. Now, when you lose, the problem is if you're in the first group and you lose, you just go back to being a regular fighter, getting your show and win bonus, right? And so you lose all that stuff. So that's a huge step down. If you're in the second group, maybe you negotiate a better contract where you get a kind of a large guarantee compared to other fighters, high six figures, maybe up to 7 figures. And if you're in the final group, a Ronda Rousey, a GSP Anderson Silva, even losing the title, you can keep almost all the the benefits you had as a champion, the pay, because now you're such an attraction draw. I suspect on everybody in this card, I don't know if anybody in this card, a few of the champs, well, let me see, I guess. I can't think of one. I don't know if any of the champs, tell you the truth, are in the second or third group. I think they're all in that kind of early phase champion class, right? Where they get their base pay and pay-per-view points. And amongst the biggest star I've seen recently was Dustin Poirier, who probably had a great contract outside owning the belt. So that's why I think this event is going to have a much cheaper, much lower payout for the fighters than you would see for UFC, at least comparatively to UFC 100 and UFC 200.
I have a question.
Fire away.
BMF titles, how does that work? Do we know?
Well, apparently, I don't know for sure, but it sounds like Gaethje is getting pay-per-view points for this event. That's my understanding. I could be wrong completely. The BMF title was just a made-up title. They just threw it on. But I believe when they first did it, they gave Nate Diaz pay-per-view points for it. In fact, I know they did. And since they've continued it, I think they're going to give Gaethje this. Max Holloway made a point, though, that because they're promoting it, he should get a pay bump, that they're using this as the centerpiece of the fight. I think he's right. Mm-hmm. They've been advertising this fight. This is kind of the big draw of the event, even though it's not the top fight, at least in the United States. In China, I'm sure there's another fight that's the much big attraction in China. But here in the United States, that seems to be the big fight. And he, during the presser, he talked about he's getting his regular contract. Well, that would tell me that he is not getting, as a challenger, pay-per-view points. He's getting his regular payout, whatever that is right now. And he probably deserves more of a main card type purse, because they are being, even though they're the third fight down from the top, they are kind of the main focus for fans.
All right. Final little spin-off question from everything you said there. A lot of people, and Max Holloway right here is our prime example. Okay, so people listen up to what John is going to tell you here. But a lot of folks seem to think by virtue of being a challenger to a title holder that they get to renegotiate their contract. But Max Holloway is a prime example here on the biggest card of the year, possibly of the past, of a 5-year period. I would imagine this is going to be one of the biggest ones of the next 5 years. And even here, he was not able to negotiate better than his current contract. So, John, explain that. Because everybody seems to think just going into a title fight, especially with a bigger star like Conor McGregor, oh, he's going to fight Conor McGregor, he's going to make bank. Explain why that isn't always the case.
Well, it's because you have no real leverage as a fighter in the UFC. These are not, when you go through a title fight, you're not a mandatory. The UFC doesn't have to guarantee you the title fight, right? And you're already probably under contract, because as we've seen from the emails from the antitrust suit, they try to renegotiate before you even get offered a title fight to make sure you're under contract. So you're under contract. You have no right to your ranking or title shot, like in boxing. Again, we bring up boxing because boxing is basically the identical to the UFC or MMA, except for the fact that we don't have separations of sanctioning organizations from promoters. But in boxing, through the various court rulings, fighters are granted a legal right to the ranking, and they have, when they're declared a mandatory, they have a right to challenge for the title, and so you're forced to negotiate with them, and so they have leverage at that point. In the UFC, because all the top fighters are signed to the UFC, because they control who gets to fight for the title, there's no leverage for the fighters. They're not scarce. So the fighter, if you do not agree to the terms and don't want to accept the fight, they will just move on to the next guy. And so what I imagine happened here, a lot of people want to fight on UFC 200, and maybe a lot of people tried to negotiate better deals for UFC 200.
You mean 300?
And maybe, what's that? Or 300? They're all the same. Goddamn, two zeros. UFC 300. They had trouble announcing main events for this event, right? Mm-hmm. It's very possible a lot of fighters were holding out for better deals or trying to negotiate, thinking that, oh, this is UFC 300. They have the money to put up for it. And the UFC just moved down the line until they could line up the top fights they could at the current payout these fighters are getting. And this is a prime example, too, of why the idea that fighters just need to hold out and get more is not realistic. Because as we see, if everybody's under contract to the UFC that's a top fighter, sooner or later you're going to find someone that's willing to take the fight. Exactly. And if you can do that, well, then your holdout doesn't mean much. So I think that's kind of what we might have happened to see here. And so fighters, again, don't have much leverage. They can't negotiate. Now, every once in a while, it kind of changes. Every once in a while, there's a fighter that has leverage. And I think two examples recently, if you look at what Sean Strickland was complaining about his pay recently, right? Well, look at his deal and what supposedly Paulo Costa supposedly has, right? Paulo Costa signed a 4-year, $1 million a fight, according to his manager girlfriend, and I believe it's probably true, contract. And the reason he was able to do that is because of the sunset clause. Just like Ngannou, his contract was ending, and because it was ending and he had the right to leave, the UFC felt compelled to make a much better than normal offer to retain him. Ngannou, even though he did leave, the offers, the closer he got to that free agency, which gave him leverage, the bigger and bigger the offers got, much bigger. So it shows you that when you have some leverage, you get a better deal. But UFC fighters as a whole don't have much leverage and they don't have scarcity. So them holding out doesn't mean anything because they're easily replaceable because everybody's under contract.
All right. And that is going to bring an end to our UFC 300 mini-sode. We hope you've enjoyed it. We have more UFC 300 content coming next week, along with a slew of other really good stuff for you guys. Right now, I want you to follow John on Twitter. He is, guess what? @HeyNotTheFace. His direct messages are open. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, shoot him a direct message. He is not HeyNotTheFace. He's HeyNotTheFace at gmail.com. If you prefer email, you can reach him there with your questions, comments, suggestions. My Twitter messages are also open. I am at Crooklyn MMA. My email is also open, crooklyn949 at gmail.com. Anything you send to me will be shared with John. On that fine note, you guys know the drill. Until next time, please stay safe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!